Welcome to Shattered Sky Stories. Remember to hit the like button and the subscribe button so you don't miss any sci-fi stories. Now sit back and enjoy. Murray Benson adjusted his filtration mask and checked his chronometer for the third time in 10 minutes. The twilight zone stretched endlessly in both directions, a perpetual dusk. Behind him, the habitation domes of New Terminus glowed with artificial warmth, their curved surfaces reflecting the pale amber light that defined their narrow slice of existence. Ahead, the landscape grew progressively brighter, the rocky terrain bleached white by the relentless sun that never moved from its position on the horizon. Today marked his 57th escort. 57 souls guided to the boundary between civilization and the scorched wasteland beyond. 57 people who had broken the sacred laws that kept their society functioning in perfect, ordered harmony. "Guard Benson," came the crackling voice through his comm unit. "Prisoner transport approaching your position. ED, 4 minutes. Copy that, Central." He pulled his thermal cloak tighter around his shoulders, feeling the familiar weight of his sidearm against his hip. The weapon had never been fired in the line of duty. Exiles rarely resisted once they understood their fate. Most walked to their doom with a strange, hollow acceptance. The transport vehicle emerged from the gloom like a metal beetle, its treads crunching over the perpetually frozen ground of the Twilight Zone's outer edge. Through the reinforced windows, Murray could see the pale face of today's condemned, Dr. Jared Leonard, former head of atmospheric studies. Leonard's crime was curiosity. He had been caught attempting to analyze light samples from beyond the safe zone, violating Ordinance 347 regarding unauthorized research into the sunside phenomena. Jackson Hill, Murray's partner for the past 3 years, stepped down from the transport's passenger seat. At 26, Hill possessed the eager devotion of someone who had never questioned the system that raised him. His uniform was immaculate, his posture rigid with purpose. "Beautiful morning for an exile, isn't it?" Hill said, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air. Despite the grim nature of their work, Hill maintained an unsettling cheerfulness that Murray had never quite understood. "Every morning's the same out here," Murray replied, watching as the transport guards opened the rear compartment. Dr. Leonard stumbled out, his wrists bound with polymer restraints, his research coat replaced with the gray tunic of the condemned. Leonard was older than most exiles, perhaps 60, with silver hair and deep-set eyes that held an intelligence Murray had seen dim in dozens of others during the march to the boundary. But there was something different about Leonard's gaze. Where others showed resignation or terror, Leonard's eyes burned with a desperate urgency. "Dr. Leonard," Murray said formally, "by order of the Council of New Terminus, you are hereby exiled to the sun-scorched territories for violations of atmospheric research protocols. Do you understand the nature of your punishment?" Leonard nodded slowly, but his eyes never left Murray's face. "I understand more than you think, Guard Benson." The transport departed with mechanical efficiency, leaving the 3 men alone in the perpetual twilight. Murray had performed this ritual so many times he could navigate to the boundary with his eyes closed. The walk would take approximately 40 minutes. 40 minutes for the condemned to contemplate their fate, 40 minutes for Murray to ignore the growing weight of what he was about to do. They walked in silence for the first 20 minutes, their boots crunching rhythmically on the frost-covered ground. The landscape grew steadily brighter as they approached the boundary, and Murray could see the first warning markers, tall metal posts topped with radiation sensors and temperature gauges. Beyond them, the ground began to show the telltale signs of the sunside: cracked earth, bleached stone, and an oppressive brightness that hurt to look at directly. "Tell me something, Guard Benson," Leonard said suddenly, his voice carrying easily in the thin air. "In all your years of service, have you ever wondered what happens to us out there?" Murray kept his eyes fixed ahead. "Exile is exile, Doctor. The sunside is uninhabitable. You know this." "Uninhabitable," Leonard repeated, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "Yes, that's what they tell us. But my research suggests otherwise." Hill quickened his pace, moving closer to Leonard. "Prisoner will maintain silence during escort. Further violations will result in additional restraints." But Leonard continued as if Hill hadn't spoken. "The atmospheric readings, Benson. The temperature fluctuations. The radiation patterns. None of it matches what it should be for a tidally locked planet. None of it." "Enough," Murray said, but he felt a familiar, uncomfortable stirring in his chest. The same feeling he'd experienced during several previous escorts when the condemned had spoken of inconsistencies, of things that didn't make sense. They reached the first boundary marker, a towering metal post topped with warning beacons and environmental sensors. Beyond it, the ground was visibly different, cracked, bleached white, and seemingly devoid of life. The air shimmered with heat despite the planet's eternal positioning. "This is your final opportunity to make peace with your fate," Murray said, following the prescribed script. "Beyond this point lies exile. There is no return." Leonard turned to face both guards, his eyes wide with an intensity that made Murray's skin crawl. "They're not random, Benson. The exiles. They're not punishment. Look at the pattern. Atmospheric researchers, geologists, anyone who studies the sunside. Anyone who might discover the truth." "What truth?" The question escaped Murray's lips before he could stop himself. Hill shot him a sharp look. "Guard Benson, the prisoner is attempting to spread seditious theories. We should complete the exile immediately." But Leonard stepped closer, lowering his voice to an urgent whisper. "The light, Benson. It's alive. It's watching. And they're feeding it." The words hit Murray like a physical blow. He had heard similar phrases before, fragments of desperate rambling from other condemned scientists, researchers, and truth seekers. But Leonard's voice carried a conviction that chilled him to the bone. "Move," Hill commanded, pushing Leonard forward toward the boundary. But as they crossed the marker, something unprecedented happened. The air itself seemed to pulse with a low, subsonic vibration that Murray felt in his bones rather than heard. The brilliant white light ahead of them flickered, not like a failing artificial illumination but like something organic, something breathing. And in that moment of fluctuation, Murray saw something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Shapes moved in the blazing light, tall, impossibly thin silhouettes that seemed to dance and writhe in patterns that hurt to perceive. The shapes were humanoid but wrong, stretched and elongated, their movements too fluid, too graceful for anything natural. And they were moving toward the boundary. "Jesus," Hill breathed, his hand instinctively moving to his sidearm. Leonard laughed, a sound of pure terror mixed with vindication. "You see them too, don't you? The sun-bleached. The ones who came before us." The shapes grew closer, and Murray could see that what he had taken for dancing was actually a coordinated movement, a purposeful approach. The figures were pale beyond description, their skin seemingly translucent, their eyes, if they could be called eyes, burning with an internal light that was both beautiful and horrifying. "We need to leave," Murray said, his voice tight with fear. "Now." But Leonard broke free from Hill's grip and ran toward the approaching figures, his restraint somehow having fallen away. "I won't be another sacrifice," he screamed. "I won't feed your God." The moment Leonard crossed into the truly bright zone, the change was immediate and terrible. His skin began to pale, becoming translucent, and that same internal light began to burn in his eyes. But instead of screaming in pain, Leonard's face showed an expression of ecstatic horror, as if he was experiencing both agony and revelation simultaneously. "The Lux," Leonard called back to them, his voice already changing, becoming something else. "It speaks through the light. It hungers through the council. The bargain must be maintained." Murray grabbed Hill's arm and pulled him back toward the safety of the Twilight Zone, but as they ran, Leonard's final words echoed across the wasteland. 57, Benson. Count them. Count the offerings. The pattern will show you the truth." They ran until the boundary was far behind them, until the oppressive brightness faded back to the familiar amber glow of the Twilight Zone. When they finally stopped, both guards were gasping, their hearts racing with terror and adrenaline. "What the hell was that?" Hill demanded, his usual composure completely shattered. Murray stood silently, his mind racing. 57 escorts. Leonard had known the exact number. How could he have known? And what did he mean about a pattern? "We report that Dr. Leonard was successfully exiled," Murray said finally. "Nothing more. But those things. Nothing more, Hill." Murray's voice carried a finality that brooked no argument. "We saw nothing. We report nothing. We did our job." But even as he spoke the words, Murray knew that everything had changed. The comfortable routine of his service, the moral certainty that had allowed him to sleep at night despite escorting dozens of people to their doom, all of it was cracking like ice under pressure. That night, alone in his quarters, Murray pulled up the exile records on his personal terminal. The data was supposed to be classified, but years of service had granted him access to the basic statistics. 57 exiles in his career. Leonard had been right about the number. But as Murray scrolled through the list, a pattern began to emerge that made his blood run cold. The names, the professions, the alleged crimes, they weren't random at all. Atmospheric researchers, geologists, physicists, engineers who had worked on the environmental systems. Anyone whose work might have brought them into contact with data about the sun side. And the timing. Every exile coincided with periods of increased unrest in the colony, times when resources were stretched thin, when the population grew restless. The exiles weren't just punishment, they were a release valve, a way to eliminate potential troublemakers while maintaining the illusion of justice. But Leonard's final words suggested something far worse than simple political expedience. The way he had changed at the boundary, the light in his eyes, the ecstatic horror on his face, it pointed to something Murray's rational mind refused to accept. A soft chime from his terminal indicated an incoming message. Murray opened it and felt his world shift beneath his feet. Guard Benson, the message read, report to council chambers at 0800 tomorrow for debriefing regarding today's exile incident. Bring all recorded observations and personal logs. By order of First Counselor Aldrich. Murray's hands trembled as he read the message again. An incident. They knew something had happened at the boundary. And now they wanted to debrief him. A process that, in his experience, was less about gathering information and more about ensuring silence. He thought of the 57 people he had escorted to exile. He thought of Leonard's final words about patterns and offerings. And he thought of the pale figures moving in the blazing light, their too fluid grace, their burning eyes. For the first time in his career as an exile guard, Murray Benson began to question whether he was a protector of society or an accomplice to something far more sinister. The crack in the facade had become a chasm, and Murray could see the darkness beneath. Murray arrived at the council chambers 15 minutes early, his formal dress uniform crisp and his personal logs meticulously prepared. The massive building rose from the center of New Terminus like a monument to order and control, its white walls gleaming in the artificial light that bathed the colony. Inside, the corridors were sterile and quiet, lined with portraits of previous first counselors dating back to the founding of the settlement. The debriefing room was smaller than Murray had expected, a sterile white chamber with a single table and 3 chairs. First Counselor Aldrich sat opposite the door, flanked by 2 individuals Murray didn't recognize. Aldrich was a woman in her 60s, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, with the kind of presence that commanded absolute attention. The others, a younger man with pale skin and nervous energy, and an older woman with cybernetic implants replacing her left eye and ear, remained silent as Murray entered. Guard Benson, Aldrich said, her voice carrying the authority of absolute power. Please sit. Murray took the chair across from them, placing his data tablet on the table with practiced precision. First Counselor, thank you for this opportunity to. Yesterday's exile did not proceed according to standard protocol, Aldrich interrupted, her gaze never leaving Murray's face. You and Guard Hill reported anomalous atmospheric conditions at the boundary. Please elaborate. The question was delivered with surgical precision, designed to elicit specific information while revealing nothing about what the council already knew. Murray had expected this. He had spent most of the night preparing his response. Dr. Leonard displayed unusual behavior during the escort, Murray began, sticking as closely to the truth as possible. He made various claims about his research, attempting to justify his violations of atmospheric study protocols. When we reached the boundary, there were visual distortions in the air, possibly related to temperature variations. The younger man leaned forward slightly. Visual distortions? Heat shimmer, Murray said. Nothing more. Dr. Leonard became increasingly agitated and attempted to flee into the sunside. The exile was completed successfully. Aldrich exchanged a glance with her companions, a look that lasted just a moment too long. Guard Benson, your service record is exemplary. 57 successful exiles over 8 years. Your dedication to maintaining order is appreciated. There was again. The exact number. Leonard had known it, and now Aldrich was using it deliberately. Murray kept his expression neutral, but his mind was racing. However, Aldrich continued, recent events have demonstrated the need for enhanced security protocols. Effective immediately, All exile guards will undergo psychological evaluation and loyalty verification. This is not a punishment, you understand? Merely a precaution to ensure the continued stability of our society. The woman with the cybernetic implants spoke for the first time, her voice carrying a metallic undertone. Dr. Reeves will conduct your evaluation this afternoon. Standard procedure, nothing to be concerned about. Murray knew that psychological evaluations in New Terminus were anything but standard. Citizens who entered the evaluation centers sometimes emerged with gaps in their memory, fundamental changes in their personality, or, in extreme cases, didn't emerge at all. Of course, Murray said. I'm happy to cooperate with any security measures. Excellent. Aldrich stood, signaling the end of the meeting. One final matter, Guard Benson. You are temporarily reassigned from exile duty pending the completion of your evaluation. You'll be working internal security, monitoring the lower residential levels for signs of unrest or sedition. Guard Hill will handle your exile responsibilities. As Murray left the council chambers, his mind was spinning with implications. The reassignment wasn't random. They were removing him from the boundary, preventing him from witnessing any more anomalies, while they decided what to do with him. The psychological evaluation would either wipe his memories of yesterday's incident or determine whether he needed to be permanently silenced. But they had made one mistake. By assigning him to monitor the lower residential levels, they had given him access to parts of the colony he had never seen before. Areas where the colony's carefully maintained facade might be thinner, where desperate people might be willing to talk. Murray spent the morning familiarizing himself with his new duties. The lower levels were a stark contrast to the orderly upper districts where he lived. Here the corridors were narrower, the lighting dimmer, and the air carried the scent of too many people living in too small a space. The residents moved with the careful, measured steps of people who understood that drawing attention was dangerous. His assignment was to monitor Sector 7, a residential block housing primarily maintenance workers, food processors, and other essential but low-status personnel. His supervisor, a worn-looking woman named Sergeant Davies, showed him to a small observation post equipped with surveillance equipment and records of previous incidents. Pretty quiet down here most of the time, Davies explained, her voice carrying the tired resignation of someone who had seen too much. Biggest problems are usually domestic disputes and minor theft. Nothing that can't be handled with a reprimand or reduction in rations. Murray nodded, settling into the chair behind the monitoring desk. What about sedition? Anti-council activity? Davies gave him a sharp look. You'd be surprised how little of that we see down here. People are too busy trying to survive to worry about politics. She paused at the door. But Benson, if you do see something, make sure you're certain before you report it. False accusations have a way of destroying lives. Left alone, Murray began reviewing the surveillance records, but his mind kept returning to Leonard's words. The pattern. The offerings. 57 people, all with knowledge or skills that might threaten the council's version of reality. As the hours passed, Murray noticed something odd in the surveillance feeds. The residents of Sector 7 moved with a rhythm that seemed almost choreographed, not the random bustle of people going about their daily lives, but something more deliberate. And at regular intervals, small groups would gather in specific locations. Maintenance closets, empty storage rooms, abandoned sections of corridor, for brief conversations that the surveillance equipment couldn't quite capture. By the third hour of his shift, Murray realized he was watching the operation of an underground information network. The residents weren't just surviving, they were communicating, sharing information, and doing it in a way that avoided the colony's extensive surveillance system. Murray made a decision that would have been unthinkable 24 hours earlier. Instead of reporting the suspicious activity, he began to map it. He tracked the movement patterns, identified the key gathering points, and started to understand the structure of what appeared to be a colony-wide resistance network operating right under the council's nose. Near the end of his shift, Murray witnessed something that changed everything. In maintenance room C7, he watched as 3 workers gathered around a small device that looked like a modified atmospheric sensor. One of them, a middle-aged man with grease-stained coveralls, was speaking urgently while pointing at readings displayed on the device's screen. Murray enhanced the audio pickup and managed to catch fragments of the conversation. Readings are definitely increasing. Boundary temperature fluctuations matched the pattern. Dr. Leonard was right about the atmospheric composition. Leonard's name. These maintenance workers were continuing his research, using modified equipment to study the very phenomena that had gotten him exiled. Murray watched as they carefully concealed the device and dispersed, each taking a different route back to their quarters. Over the next 3 days, Murray documented everything he observed while maintaining the appearance of dutiful surveillance. The resistance network was more extensive than he had imagined. It included not just maintenance workers but food processors, communications technicians, and even some mid-level administrators. They were sharing information, conducting unauthorized research, and most remarkably, they were doing it all while remaining invisible to the official surveillance apparatus. On the 4th day, Murray received a message that his psychological evaluation had been scheduled for the following morning. He knew he was running out of time. Whatever these people had discovered about Leonard's research, whatever pattern they had identified, Murray needed to understand it before Dr. Reeves began digging through his memories. That evening, Murray made another decision that would have been impossible a week earlier. Instead of returning to his quarters after his shift, he made his way to maintenance room C7. The room was empty when he arrived, but Murray didn't have to wait long. The middle-aged man in coveralls appeared 15 minutes later, followed by 2 companions, a young woman with technical tattoos on her arms and an elderly man whose bearing suggested former military service. "I was wondering when you'd show up," the man in coveralls said, his voice calm but wary. "Security guard Benson, isn't it? Though I hear you used to be an exile guard." Murray felt his hand move instinctively toward his weapon, but something in the man's tone made him pause. "How do you know who I am?" "We know a lot of things," the elderly man said, "including what you saw at the boundary 4 days ago, including why they reassigned you, including why you're scheduled for psychological evaluation tomorrow morning." The young woman activated a small device that emitted a subtle electronic humming. "Surveillance dampener," she explained. "We've got maybe 20 minutes before the security systems notice the gap in coverage." Murray stared at the 3 of them, his worldview continuing to crumble. "Who are you people?" "We're what's left of the real scientists," the man in coveralls said. "The ones who ask questions. The ones who look for patterns. My name is Peterson. I used to work atmospheric analysis before they decided that was too dangerous for civilians. This is Sarah Mills, Communication Systems, and Frank Rodriguez, former military intelligence. We've been continuing Leonard's research," Sarah said, producing the modified sensor Murray had seen in the surveillance feeds. "And we found something that's going to make your blood run cold." The device projected a holographic display showing atmospheric readings, temperature fluctuations, and radiation patterns taken from various points around the colony's perimeter. But it was the temporal data that made Murray's breath catch in his throat. "The boundary isn't stable," Peterson explained. "The temperature, the radiation levels, the atmospheric composition, they all fluctuate in regular patterns. And those patterns correspond exactly with the exile schedule." Murray stared at the data, his mind struggling to process the implications. "You're saying the exiles affect the environmental conditions?" "We're saying the environmental conditions are artificial," Sarah said. "The entire Sunside ecosystem is being maintained by some kind of external force. And that force gets stronger every time someone crosses the boundary." Frank leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "We think Leonard was right. The exiles aren't punishment. They're offerings. Fuel for whatever's keeping this planet habitable." The room fell silent except for the humming of the surveillance dampener. Murray's mind reeled as he tried to reconcile this information with everything he had believed about their society. "The Lux," he said finally, remembering Leonard's final words. "You heard him say it," Peterson said. "We figured you might have." Leonard had been in contact with our network for months before his exile. He was trying to prove that the Council wasn't protecting us from the Sunside, they were collaborating with whatever lives there. Sarah manipulated the holographic display, showing a new set of data. "Look at this. Colony population records going back to the founding. Every time the population grows beyond a certain threshold, the exile rate increases. Every time resources become scarce, more people are convicted of crimes that result in exile. It's population control, but it's more than that. It's feeding time," Frank said grimly. Murray thought of the pale figures he had seen moving in the blazing light, their too fluid grace, their burning eyes. "What exactly do you think is happening to the exiles?" The 3 resistance members exchanged glances. Peterson spoke carefully, Based on Leonard's research and our own observations, we believe the exiles undergo some kind of transformation. They become part of whatever entity controls the sun side. The Lux, as Leonard called it. And you think the Council knows about this? We think the Council orchestrated it, Sarah said. The original colonists didn't find this planet by accident. They came here specifically because of what lives in the light. The entire colony exists as part of some kind of bargain. We provide offerings and the Lux provides stability. Murray felt sick. 57 people. 57 souls he had personally delivered to this fate. How long has this been going on? Since the founding, Frank said. Probably longer. We found records suggesting that previous civilizations on this planet made similar arrangements. The ruins in the deep caves, the artifacts that don't match any known technology, this has been happening for millennia. The surveillance dampener's humming grew more urgent, indicating their time was almost up. Peterson quickly shut down the sensor device while Sarah gathered the data tablets. They're going to wipe your memories tomorrow, Peterson said urgently. Or worse. But we might be able to help you if you're willing to help us. Murray looked at each of them, ordinary people who had risked everything to uncover a truth that could destroy them. What are you asking me to do? Help us expose the truth, Sarah said. We've been gathering evidence for months, but we need someone with access to the exile records, someone who's actually seen what happens at the boundary. And then what? Even if we could prove all of this, who would believe us? Who would act on it? Frank smiled grimly. The colony is more fragile than the Council wants us to believe. If the truth got out, if people understood that their friends and family weren't being exiled but sacrificed, there would be riots. The entire system would collapse. And what happens then? Murray asked. If this entity really does keep the planet stable, if we really are dependent on these offerings, what happens to us when the bargain ends? The question hung in the air like a poison gas. None of them had an answer because the truth was that they didn't know what would happen if the feeding stopped. They only knew that they couldn't continue to be accomplices to murder disguised as justice. Meet us tomorrow night, Peterson said, handing Murray a small communication device. After your evaluation, assuming you still remember who you are. Warehouse District, Section K-12. If you're still yourself, we'll give you everything we've found. If you're not. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. As Murray made his way back to his quarters, his mind was a storm of competing thoughts and emotions. In less than 12 hours, he would either be a mindless automaton serving the Council's interests, or a traitor to everything he had believed about his society. There was no middle ground, no comfortable compromise. But as he lay in his narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, Murray realized that the choice had already been made. The moment he had seen those pale figures moving in the light, the moment he had heard Leonard's desperate warning, the moment he had counted 57 names on a list, he had already chosen his side. The question now was whether he would survive long enough to act on that choice. That night, Murray dreamed of burning eyes and translucent skin, of figures that danced in light too bright to comprehend. And in his dreams he heard Leonard's voice, changed but still recognizable, calling out across the wasteland. The pattern will show you the truth. Murray's eyes snapped open at 0530, 30 minutes before his usual wake-up time. The psychological evaluation wasn't scheduled until 0900, but he had work to do first. Moving quietly through his morning routine, he accessed his personal terminal and began copying every file he had legitimate access to: exile records, atmospheric reports, population statistics, anything that might support Peterson's claims about the colony's true purpose. The data transfer took longer than expected, and Murray found himself checking the chronometer every few minutes. At 0800, he sealed the copied files in a secure storage device small enough to conceal in his uniform, said a silent goodbye to his quarters, and made his way to the medical district. Dr. Reeves's office was located in the deepest part of the medical complex, accessible only through a series of security checkpoints that scanned everything from biometrics to psychological stress indicators. The waiting room was sterile white, furnished with a single chair and a table holding outdated colony newsletters. Murray sat rigidly, his hand unconsciously moving to where the data storage device was concealed beneath his uniform jacket. "Guard Benson?" Dr. Reeves appeared in the doorway, a thin man in his 40s with pale skin and eyes that seemed to look through rather than at Murray. "Please come in." The examination room contained equipment Murray had never seen before: complex arrays of sensors, neural interface devices, and what appeared to be a chair designed to completely immobilize whoever sat in it. Dr. Reeves gestured toward the chair with a smile that never reached his eyes. "Just a standard psychological evaluation," Dr. Reeves said, his voice carrying the same metallic undertone Murray had noticed in the cybernetic woman at the council briefing. "Please, make yourself comfortable." As Murray approached the chair, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. On a side table, partially concealed by medical instruments, lay a data tablet displaying what appeared to be personality profiles. The screen showed two columns: current state and desired state. Under current state, Murray could read fragments: questioning authority, unusual stress indicators, potential security risk. Under desired state, the notes were even more disturbing: complete loyalty to council directives, elimination of curiosity regarding exile procedures, enhanced compliance with orders. Dr. Reeves noticed Murray's attention and quickly shut off the tablet. "Please sit. We'll begin with some simple questions about your recent experiences." Murray sat in the chair, feeling restraints automatically adjust around his wrists and ankles. The restraints were supposedly for safety during the neural interface procedures, but Murray could see they were designed to prevent any possibility of escape. "Now then," Dr. Reeves said, activating various pieces of equipment around the chair. "Tell me about the Leonard exile. I understand there were some unusual circumstances." As Murray began to speak, following the same sanitized version of events he had given the council, he noticed something crucial. The neural interface devices were powering up, but they would need several more minutes to reach full activation. Dr. Reeves was stalling, keeping Murray talking while the equipment prepared to dig into his memories. "The visual distortions you reported," Dr. Reeves continued, attaching sensors to Murray's temples. "Can you describe them in more detail?" Murray realized this was his last chance. In a few minutes, the neural interface would be active, and Dr. Reeves would have access to every detail of what had happened at the boundary. Worse, he would be able to selectively edit those memories, turning Murray into another compliant tool of the council's will. "Doctor," Murray said suddenly, "before we continue, I have a confession to make." Dr. Reeves paused in his preparations, raising an eyebrow. "Oh, I lied in my report to the council. There was more to the Leonard exile than I admitted." The lie worked perfectly. Dr. Reeves's attention focused completely on Murray, his hands moving away from the neural interface controls. "Please elaborate." Murray began describing the pale figures, the light that seemed alive, Leonard's transformation. But as he spoke, he was working on the restraints. Years of security training had taught him basic escape techniques, and the restraints, while sophisticated, weren't designed to hold someone with his knowledge and determination. "And Leonard said something about the Lux," Murray continued, feeling the left wrist restraint give way. "He claimed the council was feeding it with the Exiles." Dr. Reeves leaned forward, his eyes bright with interest. "Did he provide any evidence for this claim?" "He mentioned a pattern. Something about the timing of the Exiles." Murray worked on the ankle restraints while maintaining eye contact with Dr. Reeves. "He seemed to think the Exiles weren't random." "Fascinating," Dr. Reeves murmured, making notes on his tablet. "And what was your reaction to these claims?" Murray felt the second ankle restraint release. "I thought he was delusional. But now I'm not so sure." It was the truth, and something in Murray's voice must have conveyed that sincerity because Dr. Reeves suddenly looked up from his notes, his expression changing from professional interest to alarm. "Guard Benson, I think we should." Murray lunged from the chair, his freed limbs allowing him to tackle Dr. Reeves before the man could activate an alarm. They struggled briefly, knocking over medical equipment and sending instruments clattering to the floor. Murray managed to subdue the doctor and restrain him with the same devices that had been used on Murray moments before. "I'm sorry," Murray said as he activated the neural interface equipment. "But I need to know what you've done to the other guards." Dr. Reeves's eyes widened in terror as Murray began adjusting the interface settings. "You don't understand what you're doing. The procedures are for the good of the colony." "Show me," Murray said, activating the memory extraction protocols. "Show me what you've done to my colleagues." The neural interface revealed horrors that Murray hadn't imagined. Dr. Reeves's memories contained dozens of psychological evaluations. Guards, administrators, even council members who had shown signs of questioning the official narrative. Some had undergone memory modification, their inconvenient curiosity replaced with blind loyalty. Others had been subjected to complete personality restructuring, emerging as hollow shells of their former selves. But the most disturbing revelation came from Dr. Reeves's deepest memories, images of his own initiation into the council's inner circle. Murray watched in horror as the memory played out. Dr. Reeves standing in a chamber deep beneath the colony, surrounded by robed figures, witnessing something that made Murray's encounter at the boundary seem tame by comparison. The Lux was not just an entity living in the light. It was vast, ancient, and completely alien to human understanding. And it was not just accepting the exiled humans, it was transforming them, incorporating their consciousness into its own collective existence. The pale figures Murray had seen were not the remains of the exiles. They were extensions of the Lux itself, appendages of a cosmic intelligence that viewed human consciousness as a particularly nutritious form of sustenance. And the council was not just aware of this arrangement. They were active participants, viewing the sacrifice of their own citizens as a necessary price for the stability and protection the Lux provided. Murray disconnected from the neural interface, his hands shaking with rage and revulsion. Dr. Reeves hung unconscious in the restraints, his mind temporarily overwhelmed by the forced memory extraction. Murray gathered everything he could from the doctor's office: files, data tablets, memory storage devices, and prepared to leave. But as he reached the door, an alarm began wailing throughout the medical complex. Security forces would arrive within minutes. Moving quickly through corridors now filled with flashing emergency lights, Murray made his way toward the warehouse district. The alarm meant his absence had been discovered, which meant his psychological evaluation had been a trap from the beginning. The council knew exactly what he had witnessed at the boundary, and they had been planning to either reprogram or eliminate him. The warehouse district was a maze of industrial buildings and storage facilities on the colony's outer edge, close enough to the boundary that the air carried a hint of the heat and light from the sun side. Murray found Section K-12 as armed security forces began flooding the residential areas, conducting a systematic search for the missing guard. Peterson, Sarah, and Frank were waiting in the abandoned warehouse, along with nearly 24 other colonists Murray didn't recognize. The group included maintenance workers, food processors, communications technicians, and even a few people whose clean uniforms suggested mid-level administrative positions. "You're early," Peterson said, noting Murray's disheveled appearance and the stolen medical equipment he carried. "I'm guessing the psychological evaluation didn't go as planned?" Murray dumped the stolen data on a makeshift table constructed from shipping crates. "The evaluation was a setup. They know what I saw at the boundary and they were planning to wipe my memories or worse." He looked around at the assembled group. "How many of you are there?" "More than you might think," Sarah said, activating several pieces of communication equipment. "Less than we need. Word is spreading about your escape, but the security forces are conducting house-to-house searches. We have maybe an hour before they find this location." Frank gestured toward the data Murray had brought. "What did you manage to get from Dr. Reeves?" "Everything," Murray said grimly. "Memory files, patient records, and something else. The council isn't just collaborating with this entity, they worship it. The psychological evaluations, the personality modifications, it's all designed to create a population of compliant servants who will never question the exile system." As Murray connected Dr. Reeves's stolen devices to the Resistance Network's equipment, the full scope of the council's deception became clear. The holographic displays filled with data that painted a picture of systematic manipulation spanning decades. "Look at this," Sarah said, pointing to population control algorithms. "The exile selection isn't based on actual crimes. It's based on psychological profiles, genetic markers, and intellectual capacity. They're specifically targeting people who might figure out the truth." Another colonist, a young man with the calloused hands of a maintenance worker, spoke up. "My brother was exiled 2 years ago for seditious behavior. All he did was ask questions about why we never trade with other colonies." "Because there are no other colonies," Murray said, accessing more of Dr. Reeves's memory files. "At least not anymore. The Lux has been feeding on human settlements for centuries. We're not the first colony to make this bargain, and we won't be the last." The revelation hit the group like a physical blow. They had been hoping their society was unique, that somehow they could find a way to escape or negotiate with the entity. The knowledge that they were part of an ancient pattern of exploitation and consumption made their situation seem hopeless. "So what do we do?" asked an older woman Murray didn't recognize. "Even if we could expose the truth, even if we could convince people to revolt, what then? If this thing really does control the planet's environment, we'd all die without the Council's arrangement." Murray pulled up the atmospheric data Peterson's group had collected. "That's what they want us to believe. But look at these readings. The environmental conditions aren't stable, they're artificially maintained. The Lux isn't protecting us from a hostile environment, it's creating a hostile environment to keep us dependent." Peterson nodded, understanding immediately. The planet's natural state is habitable. The sun side isn't scorched because of tidal locking, it's scorched because the Lux is actively making it uninhabitable. "Which means," Frank added, "that if we could disrupt the entity's influence, the planet might return to its natural state. We might not need the Council's protection at all." Sarah was already working on the communication equipment, establishing connections with resistance cells throughout the colony. "We need to move fast. Once the security forces realize we have Dr. Reeves's data, they'll lock down all communications and begin mass arrests." Over the next hour, as security patrols grew closer to their location, the resistance network finalized their plan. It was desperate and had little chance of success, but it was their only option for breaking the cycle of sacrifice and servitude. The plan had 3 components. First, they would broadcast Dr. Reeves's memory files and the stolen data across every communication channel in the colony, exposing the truth about the Exiles and the Council's collaboration with the Lux. Second, a strike team would attempt to reach the colony's central power grid and overload it, disrupting the artificial systems that maintain the boundary between the Twilight Zone and the Sunside. Third, Murray would return to the boundary itself, using his access codes as an exile guard to plant explosive devices that might disrupt the entity's feeding process. "The timing has to be perfect," Frank explained as they prepared their equipment. "The broadcast needs to happen simultaneously with the power disruption and the boundary explosion. If we're off by even a few minutes, the Council will have time to suppress the information and maintain control." As they prepared to disperse to their various objectives, Murray felt the weight of what they were attempting. They were gambling with the lives of every person in the colony, betting that their theory about the planet's natural habitability was correct. If they were wrong, they would be responsible for the deaths of thousands of people. "There's something else," Murray said, thinking of Leonard's final transformation. "The exiles who cross the boundary, they don't just die. They become part of the entity. Their consciousness gets absorbed into the Lux." The implications were staggering. Every person who had been exiled over the decades was still alive in some sense, their minds trapped within an alien intelligence that fed on human consciousness like a parasite. 57 people I escorted personally," Murray continued. "Leonard and all the others. If there's any chance of saving them, of freeing them from that thing." "One crisis at a time," Peterson said gently. "First we expose the truth and break the cycle. Then we figure out how to deal with the larger implications." The group dispersed into the night, each team heading toward their objective as security forces closed in on the warehouse district. Murray made his way toward the colony's outer perimeter, using his intimate knowledge of the exile routes to avoid the search patrols. The boundary zone looked different in the darkness, less harsh but somehow more ominous. The perpetual twilight made everything appear ghostly and uncertain, and Murray could see the distant glow of the sunside lighting the horizon like a false dawn. As he approached the first boundary marker, Murray activated his communicator and heard Sarah's voice crackling through the static. "Broadcast equipment in position. Power grid team is ready. Murray, what's your status?" "Approaching the boundary," Murray replied, checking the explosive devices in his equipment pack. "The charges are set for remote detonation, but I need to get them as close to the sunside as possible." Murray crossed the first boundary marker and felt the familiar increase in temperature and brightness. The air shimmered with heat, and he could see the pale figures in the distance, moving with their eerie, fluid grace. But this time he wasn't escorting a condemned prisoner. This time he was the one crossing the boundary by choice. As he moved deeper into the transition zone, Murray began placing the explosive charges at regular intervals, each one designed to disrupt the artificial atmospheric conditions that maintained the boundary. The devices were small but powerful, containing enough force to create significant environmental disruptions if detonated simultaneously. "Murray," came Frank's voice through the communicator, "we've got a problem. Security forces have found the warehouse. They're moving toward the power grid station. We need to accelerate the timeline." Murray looked ahead toward the truly bright zone, where the pale figures had begun moving toward him with obvious intent. "How long do you need?" 10 minutes for the broadcast, 5 more for the power disruption." "I can give you 10, Murray said, pulling out his sidearm and checking the charge. "After that, I'm detonating everything." The pale figures were close enough now that Murray could see them clearly, and what he saw made his blood run cold. They retained enough of their human appearance to be recognizable, but their skin was translucent, their eyes burned with internal light, and their movements possessed an alien fluidity that suggested their bones and muscles had been fundamentally altered. And among them Murray recognized faces. Dr. Leonard, still wearing the gray tunic of exile but transformed into something no longer entirely human. A woman Murray remembered escorting 3 years earlier, a geologist named Patricia Wells. A young man whose crime had been asking too many questions about the colony's founding. They were all there, all the people Murray had delivered to this fate, and they were moving toward him with expressions that mixed recognition, hunger, and something that might have been plea for help. "The broadcast is live," Sarah's voice crackled through the static. "All channels are carrying Dr. Reeves's memory files. The entire colony is seeing the truth about the exiles." Murray could hear distant sounds of chaos from the direction of the colony, alarms, shouting, what sounded like breaking glass. The population was reacting to the revelation, and from the sound of it, the reaction was violent. "Power grid is down," Frank reported. "The artificial atmospheric controls are failing. Murray, get out of there now." But Murray was already surrounded by the transformed exiles, their pale faces illuminated by the burning light that seemed to emanate from within their bodies. Up close, he could see that they were still conscious, still aware of what had happened to them. Their eyes held a terrible mixture of gratitude and warning. Leonard stepped forward, his voice carrying harmonics that hadn't been there when he was human. "Murray? Benson." "I'm sorry," Murray said, raising his weapon. "I'm sorry I brought you here. I'm sorry I didn't understand." "Not your fault." Leonard's transformed voice was like music played through broken instruments. "The Lux, uses guilt, uses compliance, break the chain." Murray realized that Leonard and the others weren't trying to capture him, they were trying to help him. Whatever remained of their human consciousness was fighting against the entity that had absorbed them. "Murray." Sarah's voice was urgent through the communicator. "The Council forces are mobilizing. They're bringing heavy weapons toward your position. You need to detonate now." Murray looked at the faces around him, dozens of people he had condemned to this fate, now transformed into extensions of an alien intelligence but somehow still retaining enough of their humanity to want freedom for their colony. "Tell me how," Murray said to Leonard. "Tell me how to free you." Leonard's burning eyes focused on the explosive charges Murray had placed. "Not free us. Free the colony. The boundary is the anchor. Break the anchor." Understanding flooded through Murray. The boundary wasn't just a feeding ground, it was the mechanism by which the Lux maintained its hold on the planet. By creating an artificial division between habitable and uninhabitable zones, the entity forced the colonists to remain dependent on the Council's protection. Murray activated the detonation sequence for all the charges simultaneously. The explosions lit up the boundary zone like artificial suns, sending shockwaves through the atmospheric control systems that maintained the division between zones. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The oppressive heat of the sunside began to dissipate, while the artificial barriers that had kept the colonists trapped in their narrow twilight zones started to fail. For the first time in decades, natural weather patterns began to reassert themselves across the planet's surface. But the Lux didn't surrender easily. As its control over the environment weakened, the entity itself became visible, a massive, writhing mass of light and energy that stretched across the sky like a living aurora. The transformed exiles around Murray began screaming, their consciousness torn between their human remnants and their absorption into the entity. Murray ran toward the colony as the sky above him filled with the Lux's death throes. Behind him, he could hear the sounds of the transformed exiles collapsing as the entity's hold on them weakened. Whether they were dying or being freed, he couldn't tell. The colony was in chaos when Murray reached the outer districts. The broadcast of Dr. Reeves's memories had shattered the population's faith in the council, and armed groups were fighting in the streets. Some colonists were trying to maintain the old order, terrified of change, while others were demanding the complete destruction of the council structure. Murray found Peterson's group at an emergency command post they had established in the communications center. The power grid was still down, but emergency systems were providing minimal lighting and life support. The boundary explosions worked, Sarah reported, monitoring atmospheric readings. The artificial environmental controls are failing across the planet. Natural weather patterns are returning. And the Lux? Murray asked. Frank pointed toward the observation screens showing the sky above the colony. The massive entity was clearly visible now, no longer hidden by the blinding light of the sun side. But it was changing, breaking apart, its coherent structure dissolving into fragments of light that scattered across the atmosphere. It's dying, Peterson said, or leaving. Without the boundary to anchor it to the planet, it can't maintain its presence here. Over the following hours, the truth of their gamble became clear. The planet was naturally habitable. The scorched wasteland of the sunside had been an artificial creation designed to keep the colonists dependent and afraid. As the Lux's influence faded, normal weather patterns returned, temperatures stabilized, and the rigid division between habitable and uninhabitable zones disappeared. The political situation was more complex. The council had been exposed and overthrown, but the power vacuum they left behind was filled with competing factions, each with their own vision of how the colony should be governed. Some wanted to establish a new democracy, others preferred a technocracy led by the scientists and engineers who had maintained the colony's infrastructure. Still others advocated for a complete abandonment of centralized government. Murray found himself reluctantly thrust into a leadership role, his experience as an exile guard and his role in exposing the truth giving him a unique perspective on both the old system's failures and the challenges of building something new. But it was the fate of the transformed exiles that haunted him most. As the Lux's influence faded, the pale figures had collapsed at the boundary, their altered bodies unable to survive without the entity's sustaining energy. Murray had returned to the boundary the morning after the uprising and found dozens of bodies, some recognizable as people he had escorted to exile, others so transformed they were barely identifiable as human. Leonard's body was among them, his face peaceful in death but still bearing the translucent skin and burning eyes of his transformation. In his hand, Murray found a small device that had somehow survived the entity's destruction. A final message recorded in Leonard's transformed voice. The pattern is broken. The chain is broken. But remember, there are other colonies, other worlds. The Lux is not unique. Find them. Warn them. Break their chains, too. Murray stood at the boundary that was no longer a boundary, looking out over a landscape that was slowly returning to its natural state. The colony would survive. They had food production, manufacturing capability, and enough technical knowledge to maintain their civilization without the council's oppressive control. But Leonard's final message had planted a new seed of responsibility in Murray's mind. If there were other colonies still trapped in similar arrangements, still feeding their citizens to cosmic entities in exchange for false security, then the work was far from finished. The sun moved across the sky for the first time in living memory as the planet's rotation was no longer artificially suppressed. The rigid divisions that had defined their world, Twilight Zone and Sunside, exile and citizen, order and chaos, were dissolving into something more complex but ultimately more honest. Murray looked up at the changing sky and made a silent promise to the 57 souls he had escorted to their doom. Their sacrifice had not been in vain, but their memory would serve as a reminder of the price of complacency, the danger of unquestioned authority, and the importance of asking difficult questions even when the answers might destroy everything you thought you knew about the world. The pattern was broken, but the vigilance required to keep it broken would be the work of generations. As the first natural sunset in decades painted the sky in colors the colonists had never seen, Murray began planning for the future. Not just the future of their own colony, but the future of every human settlement that might be trapped in similar cycles of exploitation and sacrifice. The sun-bleached were free, but there were other worlds, other entities, other patterns waiting to be broken. The work was just beginning.